Privasec chat. We'll start in a minute or two, so we'll give it 1 minute or two to let everyone come in. In the meantime, this is Angela from our Singapore Directives Risk Compliance team with Privasec, and myself, I'm Quan Heng or Q, also from Privasec Asia based in Singapore. I think we can start the topic because the front of it is going to be an introduction anyway. So today's topic is around MES new guidelines that were released in January 2021, and we also have additional focus around third-party risk management. So Angela, perhaps you'd like to start with an introduction to the topic?
Yeah, so the MES TRM was last revised 8 years ago in 2013. So from 2013 till today, there have been many technological advances, and hence this guideline should be kept updated to address these new risks posed by new technologies. So for those who are unfamiliar with what MES TRM stands for, TRM stands for Technology Risk Management. It is published by the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and it provides risk management principles and best practices standards to help financial institutions manage technologies. So
you mentioned there's some changes in technology trends. Could you elaborate on some of these trends?
Yeah, so one of the trends or hot topic that was discussed for the past few years is actually open banking, where banks open up their APIs to third party for them to access financial data and to provide customers with greater financial transparency. So back in 2013, I wouldn't have expected banks to actually share this kind of financial information, which might be deemed sensitive at that point in time. But along with Singapore's initiative to become a smart nation, many banks have adopted this technology, and in fact, December last year, MAS actually launched this Singapore Financial Data Exchange. In short, it is called SG Findex, where they allow Singaporeans with more than one bank account to access their investments, funds, in this online platform. So they no longer have to visit individual websites or banking applications. You can view all this in SG Findex, and it's all made possible via the use of APIs.
Okay. Other than, so some of the items you talked about, right, such as the growing maturity of SaaS products, organizations' willingness to adopt these items, these are not specific to the FSI sector, of course. So, do you see TRM being relevant outside of the FSI sector?
Yeah, I definitely see TRM being relevant outside of financial institutions. So, although this guideline is designed for financial institutions, organizations from other industries can definitely still benefit from this guideline. So, in a way, this guideline is written quite holistically, and if we take reference from a broader industry standard such as ISO 27001 NSA or ISO 27002, we would actually find many similarities in terms of their structure. Just that for the guidelines itself, it is more condensed and they focus on a few key areas.
Okay. Now, all that said, let's dive a bit deeper into the areas of focus with the new guidelines. So what kind of changes do you see, and what's the trend in terms of the way the new guidelines is worded? What are the areas that MES wants us to focus on?
So there are three key areas of focus in the new guidelines. Firstly is roles and responsibilities for board of directors and senior management in relation to their competency in managing technology risk. Second is they also place focus on cybersecurity in terms of cybersecurity assessments and cyber threat intelligence. And lastly is of course what we are focusing today on managing and the governance of third-party risks.
Okay. And since you mentioned that, let's focus on third-party risk management as well as how this is relevant in the environment we are in today.
Yeah. So I would summarize that there are two areas in the relationship between financial institutions and third parties. So firstly is the reliance of third parties services and products such as KYC services or support management tools such as HR management system. Second is the emergence of innovative technologies with fintechs and So with fintechs and in recent years, it has shown that there is like a potential benefit from data sharing, and this data was once considered too sensitive to be shared. So third parties should be held to the same level of security requirements as what the organization would hold themselves to.
Okay. Well, something interesting about this topic, right? While I was doing some research in preparation for this, so the MES TRM has been in draft for a while now. They've seen some industry responses and so on through the consultation paper. But one interesting thing would be in the recent months, I think most people have heard about the Singtel and SolarWinds incidents, and both of those can be attributed to third-party risk, right, in terms of what system was affected. So I think it's quite clear that other industries, as long as they hold sensitive data or perform critical functions and assign that to third party, risk management on that end is definitely important. So I think it's fair to say that these two are actually quite timely examples on why this is important.
Yeah, and the observation is that what you have mentioned also, like this Singtel and SolarWinds, they are actually not from like the financial sectors. So for like taking for example the Singtel data breach, it is their third-party file sharing system that has been hacked, and the hackers managed to steal 130,000 customers' data, including their NRIC. And on the global level, we have the massive SolarWinds hack, where 18,000 of its customers actually fell victims in this data breach. And as we all know, SolarWinds has actually many high-profile clients, and they include companies from like Fortune 500 or like US government agencies.
Okay. Well, this is interesting. So not only financial transactional data. If we look at the upcoming changes or the changes to PDPA, especially around the penalties, which many of our colleagues have talked about, we can see the general trend of focus around protection against data breaches. So I guess what kind of guidelines for third-party risk management what do you think are relevant, and how can organizations start to address this?
Yeah, I think as a start, right, definitely they should have like a risk management framework in place. So they should conduct a risk management to evaluate the exposure of technology risk before they even engage a third-party service provider. And this organization should also implement a more detailed system acquisition process by establishing standards and procedures for third-party evaluation and selection. So in the risk risk assessment, they should consider their software development, their quality assurance, and also their security practices. What this means is that organizations should establish a robust third-party risk management framework to help them assess and manage third-party risk, and also so that they can have better understanding and control over the technology that they acquire. And so in addition, right, talking about third-party risk, this principle of third-party risk is also applicable to API access and API use. And the new guidelines released this year, they also they highlight the risk of using public APIs, and also provide us with some practices to help ensure data integrity. So just to name a few is like having a strong encryption to securely transmit sensitive data, having a detection of suspicious activity, and ensure like the API access is being replicated timely in the event of a breach. And lastly is to ensure adequate system capacities in APIs.
I think something interesting about this is some of these items were already in the previous guidelines from 2013, but I don't think APIs were called out specifically, right?
Yeah, API is like a totally new section in this year's guideline.
Okay. So something interesting we've seen with a couple of companies is there's some organizations that are already have pretty robust programs around third-party risk management, and they tend to derive these standards from public references. Maybe they take it from NIST or ISO, they derive it from their own internal standards, or even the TRM document itself. They turn in a checklist and they give that to the partners or third parties they're working with, right? And I think one thing we've been hearing as an interesting problem is trying to manage all these standards put on these third parties. So third parties are receiving standards that follow the same principles. At a high level, they follow the same concepts. But because the individual line items, the controls, the process requirements and so on, are specifically drafted by different organizations, so they are worded a bit differently. So I think we can see a bit of pain from attempts trying to align all of these standards together internally within organizations. Some companies like AWS, I think we've seen they have very robust, they even have a compliance portal around this to put up all the statements of compliance, all the certifications they have and so on. So that's quite an interesting way to address it. So they're doing the brute force way, in other words. So I guess obligatory soundbite would be Privasec does provide third-party risk management assessment services. We do help our clients implement such a program. And the question from our audience will of course be how they can implement such a program for themselves if they're going to do it internally. What such a program will look like?
Firstly, like the organization should classify the criticality of interaction with the third parties, and if it is deemed sufficiently critical, they should include it in the third party risk management program. And then of course, what kind of assessment to be done also heavily depends on the maturity of the third party. So taking for example, you mentioned like AWS, right? They are like a very mature and very big companies with many clients. The information required for such an assessment is usually already available online, and there's no need like for such a comprehensive assessment to be performed. But for less matured companies, organizations might want to perform a more comprehensive security assessment because they might not have gone through any security checks beforehand. So you might want to put in more time and effort to have that deeper understanding of what their security practices is before you engage them.
Okay. And so I guess there are two ways of looking at it. You can perform a comprehensive assessment, and we see this happening with organizations that are a bit less mature, with a bit smaller, maybe no third-party checks, like you mentioned. So we have to do it from scratch. And then we see organizations where essentially what you see is what you get. We might send in a request to say, can you send in the last pen test report, the last penetration testing report you have. Let us know when that was. But sometimes the data is already available. If we need a SOC 2 report, it's there. If we need a PCI attestation, it's there on the site somewhere. And they are able to provide that. So I guess this is something that organizations should be able to implement either through, say, a risk assessment register or a specific register to keep track of their assets, the third parties they are working with, and so on. I think we've covered the main bulk of the items or the key points from the MES TRM guidelines. So perhaps it's time to open the floor for questions. Please type in your questions you have to the chat, and it will appear on our own screens. So we have a question around user behavioral analytics. To what extent this can or should be done? So I guess this is more around the monitoring part of things, right? How do we secure the API? So the APIs and the software in general. So user behavioral analytics, I think conceptually has been done from the sense of monitoring networks and so on, observing abnormal traffic patterns, observing abnormal requests, even to metadata like time of day and so on. So definitely it can be done. We do see some products coming up around this, and usually there's a heavy machine learning component. So basically you need to train the system to analyze what is the baseline and what is considered not normal. So we've seen this happening in networks. I believe there are products around this for API use. The last 2 or 3 years, there have been quite a few of these. So definitely possible. Anything you'd like to add around that?
In fact, I think user behavior analytics was also briefly mentioned in the new TRM guidelines that actually encourage organizations to start having this kind of analytics so they can like actively monitor like any abnormal behavior and actually catch any suspicious activities that's happening in their environment.
Okay. Yeah, definitely agree with that. So, in terms of another question we're getting is around third-party risk management, third-party risk assessment from a TRM perspective. Would this mean that it includes all types of service providers?
Yes, I believe it includes all types of service providers. So maybe just give a little background on the last TRM. So in the last TRM, the 2013 TRM, they only focus on outsourced service providers. So anything that you outsource your functions, your business to, you need to have this assessment. But in this current and the new guidelines, they actually extend this risk assessment to all third parties. So any service providers that you engage, you have to perform a risk assessment.
Of course, all this would come under the perspective of risk management, which means it will apply to varying degrees depending on the type of services or type of working relationship you have with the third party. If you're dealing with PII, dealing with transactional data, dealing with things considered sensitive, of course it will be a bit more comprehensive. For example, if Privasec uses Foodpanda to get food for lunch, they won't go under that category. So there is a risk management perspective of it, which means we need to get good at classifying how critical these systems are and apply the appropriate level of requirements on them. Another question around there is this around, I guess, the newly reviewed MES TRM and third-party risk? Are they from the same set of documents?
Yes. So they actually refers to the same set of documents. The document is actually MES TRM, and third-party risk is actually a section that they focus inside the TRM.
And the second question is a bit different from, or a bit off from the topic we're going on today, but this is interesting. So what are your thoughts on data privacy moving forward, given the different sets of challenges across the region? Maybe I can give this a go. So a couple of years ago, data privacy in terms of regulatory requirements have been fairly mature in the region. You see some requirements in the regulations. Some countries, for example, have requirements spread out across 5 or 6 different documents, depending on the industry you're in, what kind of business you're in. But over the years, there's been maturity around this, where there's increasing recognition around the differences between what's considered public utilities, public data, and private services. So that division is being made. And I think there's also increasing adoption I don't know how to put this, but around stricter requirements. So when GDPR first came out, I think there was a bit of a concern around how strict those requirements are. Although of course the requirements are of course needed. And in the recent years, we have seen China, we have seen even Cambodia, I think, recently had one around requirements or new regulations that had some similarities to what GDPR is asking for. So the spirit of PII regulatory requirements seem to be, I guess, fairly uniform at this point in time. And, well, depending on the maturity of the regulatory practices, I guess they'll be different. But what's common among all of them is they are getting a lot stricter, a lot more well-defined, a lot tighter in what they're asking for. So that's probably not going to go away anytime soon. Definitely some challenges around data privacy from this point of view, but I guess the one challenge we have around this is data privacy from a regulatory perspective is equally a legal problem as well as a technology problem, given that a lot of these data is held on technology platforms. So quite a bit of challenges there in terms of how we're going to deal with this. And I guess this is probably going to have to be part of a longer conversation. Okay, I think there are no more questions at this moment. Of course, feel free to reach out to us via email. We are happy to answer any queries you have. Thanks for joining us for today's session around MES TRM as well as third-party risk